So we need to think about getting people involved, and we need to think about turning brown into the new green. And so there are a lot of issues that we want to cover, different problems and challenges. And here to discuss it all, we have a really fantastic discussion panel, and I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly to you. Most of you already know them. Over here on my left is Professor Klaus Töpfer, who all of you know as the Soil Sustainability Expert Extraordinaire, and of the founder and executive director of the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies. And to his left, Carl Falkenberg, the EU's Director General for Environment. He has a long and illustrious record as a negotiator for the European Commission, but he doesn't just negotiate, he coordinates and advises the European Commission on a host of subjects. And next to him is Luc Ganadja. Yes, that deserves an applause, absolutely. Come on, we can do better than that. To his left is Mr. Luc Ganadja, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. His work at the UNCCD focuses on limiting land degradation and restoring where possible. He is a strong advocate for mobilizing policymakers in the fight against desertification and wants to achieve zero net land degradation by 2030. And that really deserves an applause. And of course, we'd like to welcome back Mr. Alexander Müller, who we, of course, listened to his keynote address. He's Assistant Director General of Natural Resources at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And next to him, we have, yes, that's the spirit. And I just need to get into my notes because I had the order all wrong. Because next to him is Jochen Flossbart, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, that's him. President of the German Federal Environmental Agency. It's Germany's largest national environmental authority. So no laughing matter here. He's an environmental expert and has held numerous environmental policy positions. And we'd like to welcome back, of course, Professor Reinhard Hüttl, who we met earlier. Professor Hüttl is director of the German Research Center for Geosciences at GFZ. And towards the end is Mr. Anjan Datta, a coordinator of the Global Program of Action of the United Nations Environmental Program. He has published extensively on land and water management and worked on numerous research institutions and NGOs, among many others. We're missing Manfred Kunakowicz, so once he makes it, we'll do his brief introduction. But I want to get us started, and I want to thank all the panelists for joining us in this first discussion. And just a couple of rules of engagement, if I may, before we start. As you probably know, and as Professor Klaus Töpfer has announced at the beginning, we want this to be a collaborative exercise. So we want to keep it snappy, we want to keep it engaged, and we want you to be able to jump in at any time you want. So if you feel like you have a question or you want to make a remark, just raise your hand. We've got 3 or 4 people, I think, with mics. So, you want to take part, just jump in. So with having cleared that up, I'd like to kickstart the discussion with a few very general questions to the panelists. And this is just a way to kickstart. Of course, I'll address a question to one panelist, and then the other panelists can, of course, interject and make their remarks, and you can, of course, as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, actually, start with Carl Falkenberg, because my first question is about, not to put you on the spot, but why haven't we been able to successfully put soil on the political agenda? Why do you think that is? What are your thoughts on that?
If I had the answer, I think we would have much more effectively addressed soil already. I think it has several reasons. A, there still is not an awareness in the broad public opinion that we are running out of soils. I think there is, for the moment, still the feeling that land is there plentiful, even in a relatively densely populated area as Europe. There's hardly the feeling that we have too little soil People know that we have produced food in Europe to create mountains of grain and lakes of milk. So there is still a little bit this impression that it is plentiful. And I think we need to come to an understanding that our soils are degrading. They're degrading in Europe, they're degrading worldwide. And compared to demographic growth expected to hit 9 billion people in 2050, we really have to become much, much more careful in the use of our soil to continue to produce the food we need, to have the ecosystem services that soil provides in terms of water management and all the other biodiversity-related services that soil can render. But fundamentally, I think there is not this awareness, and at the same time, there is very direct economic interest in continuing to freely use soil as individuals want. Individuals in urban centers, to have urban cities grow further into the land, the surrounding land, which very often, by the way, is among the most fertile land that we have, because that's where the cities, that's where the dwellings have originally started. To have more and more industrial use, to build more railways and more streets and seal soil off altogether. And last but not least, for our farmers who own their land very often for centuries, to continue to simply work with their land in the way in which they're used to doing it, i.e. to simply look at the surface, make sure that they can go more intensively in using this, using fertilizers, using pesticides, and going for more monoculture. All of this together is a huge problem, but politically extremely difficult to settle, because any politician who puts his fingers in this issue will get his fingers burnt.
I saw Alexander Müller taking notes. I mean, did you want to add something to what Mr. Falkenberg was saying?
Thanks a lot for putting me on the hot seat. I made some notes, and I wanted to share some lessons learned when FAO negotiated the voluntary guidelines on good governance on tenure of land, fisheries and forestries. Over a period of 5 years, we prepared and then negotiated these voluntary guidelines, and I'm happy that the chair of the Committee on Food Security is here among us. He will sit on the stage tomorrow because he successfully negotiated it. And the lessons I've learned are the following. When we talked about we have to regulate good governance of land, people said, where's the problem? So there is no direct experience that land is a problem. Air and water, you have pollution or water scarcity, people experience the problem. The second question was, there is no need for regulation because it's national. Water and air is transnational, it's transboundary, so why do you want to regulate it? It's a question of our national sovereignty, so why do you guys from the UN want to regulate everything? There's another issue. Where is the competence at the international level? There is no convention dealing with land overall, so you don't have the competence. And what was very important is that countries are different. They have different traditions, different legal systems, and in the end you cannot compare them. And behind the scene, people said, and by the way, with land degradation in the short term, one can earn a lot of money. So if you want now us to invest more into sustainable land management, you are putting pressure on our profit, and we do not know if this really materializes. So a whole bunch of issues arguing against our idea to set up this process. And therefore awareness raising has to be the starting point, identification of problems, the second, and then we have to provide solutions. And if we go along this way, I'm convinced that we can make a difference at the international level.
So I'm going to use that as a segue for my next question to Mr. Jochen Flassbarth. How do you think an event like the Global Soil Week can contribute to set soils on the political agenda? I mean, what do you think would need to be considered in an eventual follow-up to this event to do exactly that, what Mr. Müller briefly explained?
Thanks. As you invited us to jump on what others mentioned already, just allow me to add two more thoughts about your first question. Number one is soil is not attractive at all. For many people, it's simply dirt. And just to share an experience from this morning, the German minister, Peter Altmaier, and me opened a presentation, launched a presentation on our environmental specimen bank. There we freeze everything you can get, blood and eggs from seagulls, and of course also soil. And what happened is that the people around, the kids, the public, jumped to the eggs and to the fish. And of course, politicians move where the people are, so the minister as well. And the media follow the politicians, so the media as well. And nobody looked at this wonderful soil. So this is explanation number one. It is not attractive, and we have to explain in a more scrutinized way to people why soil is such an important issue for the agenda. And the second issue has been mentioned by Alexander before, and that is that there is a huge misunderstanding who belongs the soil. And it is not only about the UN. Carl could have sang the same song about the EU and the European Soil Directive. I mean, why are governments reluctant to sign a soil directive in Europe? And unfortunately, my own government belongs to the group of those. But we are not alone. And the misunderstanding is that this is a domestic resource. Or even a private resource. And of course, the land is domestic or governmental or private, but soil, fertile soil, is a different issue. That is not at all a private or a domestic concern, it's a global concern. So that is why I completely agree to what has been said by the two previous speakers. Your question, I can be very short on that. When I entered the room, although I'm not such a long time in the soil issue, I saw many people, yes, we met there last year, and there you remember. So I saw this is a family, and it's a growing family. So to be successful in politics, you need leadership. This is Klaus Töpfer, of course, and then you need his family around him. And then you need an event. And that is what Klaus Töpfer learned from the Global Water Week when he addressed some of the colleagues, why shouldn't we start with something similar? And I think it's a great idea, just getting the people around, exchanging views, and from there developing political concepts.
I think those are really, really interesting points. Yes, Mr. Kanacha, go ahead.
I think it is very important to add, to really understand the why we have not been that successful. I think that following the first and the second Industrial Revolution, where we have had more and more urbanization and more dematerialization of wealth, then we have really indeed overlooked the soil. But at the same time, we know very little about the soil biodiversity. And we also have, therefore, a kind of, we lack a convincing understanding of possible tipping point in misusing the soil biodiversity. And when we don't have that, it will be for us quite challenging to be convincing. At the same time, we need to do, soil scientists need to do a better job in bringing what is known to the general public. If we do not do that, we will just be preaching to the converted.
But is there a way to make soil attractive? I mean, does there exist a way to make soil attractive?
Yes, let me make reference to something that has worked in Korea. In Korea, coming out of the war, they have had by then 16% of the land cover only. 16% is very low. It's, though it is a humid ecosystem, 16% is quite a kind of very desertified context. And one of the things they used to be successful and bring the land cover from 16% to 66% nowadays is by a kind of campaign using one of the quotes I like very much from Korea. And if Koreans are here, they may help me pronounce it correctly. They say Shinto Bulji. Shinto Bulji means literally the body and the soil are not two, they are one. Which means we must care, we must have a real care for the soil as we care for our body. And they have used this in a very constant and consistent manner, of course with a strong leadership, and they have been successful. And everywhere I go, I notice from tradition, from religion, from quotes, all those quotes are there. We just need to maybe change the lenses we are using regarding the soil.
Professor Töpfer, do you think we could create something like that emotional kind of relationship or attachment to soil that would make it possible for people to become more aware of soil sustainability?
You see, I believe it is very closely linked with the use of soil. We come to a competition between the different functions. In this country, we discuss, not only here, intensively the question biomass production or food production. So this, if you go now in the rural area, you see the intensive discussion. We have maize all over the country, and that is only produced for biofuel production. On the other side, and this is important to add again, because the people in the rural area come back and say, but what shall we do else with those soils? There's nothing, and we have no use for it. They are not aware that Germany, per year, imports products grown on 80 million hectares of soil. 80 million hectares, Germany alone. If you see, we published it also for Europe, it is a huge quantity because we are importing the soya and all the other stuff for the production of our pigs and our cattle and what have you. These are 80 million we import. Yes. So we have a responsibility not only on our national level, only to add what you rightly mentioned. So most probably this is a way that people are very interested. That's a chance to deliver a speech in this region in Germany for the Germans, die Kreise oben im Münsterland, wie heißt Cloppenburg und Vechta. So that was my German edition. In one little village, more than 300,000 pigs. You can imagine how much imported food is there necessary to feed them in this little village. 300,000 pigs. So you have, of course, the consequences that the soils have a huge problem because they feed the cows in Argentina, but the residues of those are in Germany. So we have a huge problem in handling all this manure, as you may imagine. All this gives you a little bit of concrete topic, but I agree what the Executive Secretary of CPD mentioned, implementation. We know a lot, but we have always a gap between knowledge and action. And there, I think we have to do a little bit more. By the way, knowledge and action, I forgot two things when I made my so-called introductory speech. First, this film you saw, this movie, is available, free available in altogether 5 languages. So it is in German, in English, in French, in Spanish, and in Arabic. So if somebody wants to opt for another language, please let us know. It costs up money, that's only to add. So if somebody needs it, it is on the net and you can easily have it. So only not to forget it again. And what I really forget, that's a mistake, that we are, of course, very grateful to those who are backing us financially. That is our ministry, the Minister for Education and Research, and that is IFAD, and it is the Brandenburg Ministry, which is also underlining our activity. I only want to mention this so that you are not aware that we are paying all this out of our own pockets.
Mr. Falkenberg, you wanted to add something.
I can just come in with a quick thought on your sort of emotional relationship that sometimes helps. To me, the reason that is not there is the fact that 80% of Europeans are living in cities, and worldwide we're coming to similar levels. Here in Europe, in cities, we're living clinically clean. When I grew up, I had the privilege of still growing up on a farm, and I remember having mud fights, the horror of any parent, particularly of any parent in cities, which why so many people in cities would prefer to make soil and dirt disappear completely from their environment. So I think there is an emotional relationship that's lacking, that we have lost by moving away from countrysides into cities, into a much cleaner environment. And in that environment, soil is perceived simply as being dirt, something that we better do without. One example, one really good example that I saw, and that perhaps could be repeated relatively easily elsewhere, is a small museum on soil, which has been built in Osnabrück, in the area where you were talking about, where you can actually take school classes, and any of you could go down underground and live the universe from below the ground. And they are so technically well equipped that they can even simulate compression of heavy trucks, heavy machinery going over the top of the soil. And you see literally what's beginning to happen inside the soil. You see the life forms that are there present in our soils. And I think it would help also create a bit of an emotional relationship. But I think that is only one element. I think at the end of the day, what we have to focus on is creating the economics that would actually make sense in order to take much better care of our soils than we have done so far.
Mr. Müller?
I think this is one of the key words, the economics of land degradation, of pollution. On the other hand, there is a huge incentive framework to deal with soils. Klaus Töpfer already mentioned that in order to feed the German cows, you have to import millions of tons of feed produced somewhere else in the world. So if we look at the whole economic framework and the political framework, we can see that this framework provides the wrong incentives. There is no price for pollution of land. There is no price for land scarcity. It's just the opposite. Currently, land is kind of a commodity. And I'm not talking about land grabbing, I'm talking about global trade in animal feed and in food. And therefore, I think, of course, the starting point is that we don't have experience with soils personally. But on the other hand, it's a highly political issue. It's related in Latin America to the question of land reform, highly, highly political. On the other hand, it's related to trade. If we want to do some regulation on soils, the first answer I will get in FAO is, but don't disturb global trade. Any regulation which has a negative impact on trade, forget it immediately. So we have to look at the whole system which allows currently to deplete soil, to degrade soil, and to earn a lot of money with it. And here you can see there's a big difference. It's always at the national level, and water is dealt at international level, and therefore this Global Soil Week has to raise also political awareness that if we do not invest today, the costs will be much higher tomorrow. So from economics, they could also provide an incentive if we understand it in the right way.
This is a really, really good, important point. I saw Mr. I'll get back, Anjan Datar nodding in agreement, so I just wanted to get back. Why were you nodding in agreement?
Well, I think this is a very fundamental question that has been raised here and some of the answers. But actually, you see the whole soil question, which it did not receive political attention as it should be, of course. I mean, we are starting talking about it. One of the fundamental issues is soil was always seen within the discussion and debate of the food security. We never had a separate discussion altogether, apart from some countries where we talked about land reform. And when we talked about food security questions, the discussion was always on the whole availability questions and an access question, that how you create entitlement to food and whether food is available. But how do you produce that to make it available? The whole ecological foundations of food production system has been missing in the whole discussion. Because we never looked into that whole question until very recently we talked about it. So the whole ecological foundation, the present industrialized agriculture system, which is basically killing Mother Earth. We took it for granted for decades and decades. We thought miracle we have achieved. So the HULV, high-yielding varieties, with fertilizer, with the whole, thanks to the Weber Bush process of the whole nitrogen fertilizer, we thought we have got the miracle and with the irrigation coverage. But now we are sort of only seeing the after effects. The whole foundation has been degraded to such an extent. So I'm very pleased, and I see this, the UNCCD has made that target and vision by 2030, new net zero loss. I hope global community agrees on that and we mobilize action on that. So that's very fundamental basically. So what we have done basically over the years, we have sort of degraded it, and we never discussed that. So that's why the soil, became invisible into the political discourse. So we always, the overarching discussion was the availability question, entitlement question of the whole food security. So that was embedded into that discussion. Now we'll have to, of course, it's fine there, but is it the time that we're dealing that and we sort of open that the discussion and debate, and we take the whole question of the whole Mother Earth and his whole soil nutrients and soil health and soil regenerative capacity. So I think we'll have to broaden that discussion.
I will let Mr. Ganaja respond to your slight cynicism there about the 2030 target.
I think we need to drive land use in a way that will ensure that not only we use it sustainably, but we also go and restore what we have already degraded. So the economics assessment should also provide, to be very investment-oriented, should also provide understanding of soil carrying capacity and where we still have potential to restore what has been degraded. And we should do it in a way that will be appealing for ministers of finance, for ministers of planning, not just for ministers of environment or agriculture, because it's not just about agriculture.
Perfect. Okay, well, we're going to continue on that point because I think it's a very, very vital point. But in the meantime, Manfred Kunokovic has joined us. Thank you so much, sir, for being here. I just want to do a brief introduction, so our audience probably already knows who you are, but just in case. Deputy Director General for Climate Policy in Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation. Did I get that right? Okay. He's also Germany's board member on the Green Climate Fund and advises on climate-related issues in development policy. Thank you so much, sir. We'll be asking you a question a little bit later. We'll give you some time to settle in. I wanted to continue on your point, Mr. Ganaja, because the 2030 target seems to be very ambitious. Do you think that there is a way to strike a balance between this ambitious target and maybe something in between that could help us in terms of soil sustainability?
Yes, first, what we need is a target that will be easy to be translated in all contexts. Because when you talk about sustainable land management and land use, it doesn't mean the same thing in Germany like as in Mali or in Niger. So we need a goal that will make sense in all contexts. So, and the reason why we call in for such a goal, which will, number one, call for the minimum or minimizing degradation, bringing it to the unavoidable level, and matching it by at least the same level of restoration. If you say this to a land user, it makes sense to him. If you speak to a farmer in Niger who has been striving, because for them it's a matter of survival, striving to cope with drought and using what we call farmer-managed natural regeneration. They have been doing that. They have restored up to 5 million hectares of Niger in south of Zender and around that area. But when you look at the map that we have, the map of areas which still hold potential for restoration is not there. So it means that even those who are doing those type of work, they are still using old lenses, where it is believed that in some areas there's very little potential for restoration. So the call for going for zero net, and I will like to highlight the net, zero net, is really to ensure that we bring this to make sense to a Minister of Environment, ministers also of Finance. When I told Minister of Finance in Addis Ababa 2 years or 3 years ago, I told them, do you know that restoring degraded land in some areas in Africa is just about 50 to $200 US per hectare for 3-5 years in a sustainable manner using local ability, capability, and resources? But they said, but nobody told us it was that within reach and affordable. So we need to bring developing countries to invest their resources in addressing the issue. It's about poverty alleviation, it's about food security, it's about making water available for all, including in capacity, in quality, sorry. It's also about avoiding deforestation. Deforestation has been driven by expansion of cropland, and expansion has been driven by degradation of cropland. So when you bring all this to make sense to those who are implementing adaptation to climate change, in many of the developing countries, whenever I go, I see that NAP, let's say, I won't use our acronyms, but adaptation to climate change plans, as well as avoiding degradation in desertification, and plans for biodiversity conservation, when you compare them, they overlap by sometimes 75%. And those countries are striving to implement them in those silos. We need to pull down those ivory towers around Rio conventions and drive towards integrated approaches, holistic management. That's why we're coming up with such proposal.
So do you think there's also a divide between North and South when it comes to soil sustainability?
Yes, indeed. In the North, it's about avoiding, for instance, food losses from the plate to the bin. But in the developing countries, it's about avoiding food production losses from the field to the market, for instance. And in the developing countries, sometimes what is being lost from the farm to the market, sometimes up to 40% of the production. And this is having impact on land use.
Yes, Mr. Falconer.
I mean, if I can come in on the European side to compare what Luc was explaining globally and particularly on the developing country side, we know, and I think that the little movie that Klaus Stöffer has produced and that was shown here this morning had the example of Europe basically sealing off an entire Berlin every year. If we want to move to zero net soil degradation, that's one of the things we have to stop. But sealing off is not the only form of degradation. We have other forms of degradation that come from agriculture, that come from industrial uses, etc. So it's wider than thinking differently about the entire surface of Berlin every year in Europe. So the target for 2030 for Europe is a challenge. But Europe is no longer demographically growing. In Europe, we have an infrastructure that is allowing us very broadly to move around Europe, whether on rail, on road, or by other means. In the developing countries, you have all of the demographic growth taking place. You have cities exploding, much more urban demand on land. You have the need to still build up all the infrastructure that we in Europe already have. And we need to think there not only of limiting this, but of doing it differently. We have to think in terms of cities that are not completely sealed off, as most of our cities are. We have to think of building infrastructure that still allows some kind of permeability rather than sealing off completely as we have done here. I think the challenge really is going to be a lot larger in the developing part of this world, because that's where all the demographic pressure is taking place in the next 4 or 5 decades.
Professor Hüttl, because you wanted to interject before, so I'm going to want to give you this opportunity.
Well, to come back to your first question, why are we not giving the attention to soils that we probably should? I would argue that, as we say in Germany, alles hat seine Zeit. Everything has its time. And I think the time of the soils have come now. Why do I say this? This is actually of 3 major reasons. One reason is that we are seeing real situation that soil is a limited resource. I said this morning. And during periods where you have droughts, you realize, even if you are rich, that you cannot eat money. You may eat it, but it doesn't fulfill any function. And if you cannot buy food with your money, you have a problem. And this was experienced in the last drought. So this is one clear evidence that due to the population growth on our planet, I mean, we have doubled over the last 5 decades, from 3.5 billion to 7, and we will grow on. And we have increased our demands on soil. The way we feed ourselves is different than maybe 10, 20 years ago. And in addition, we need soils for biomass that we use now for biofuels, for biogas. We use it for chemical industry. So there's a number of aspects. And at the same time, we have climate change. That means we have a pressure on these soils which creates problems, at least in some regions, for productivity or soil fertility. So in this context, I would argue that the economic aspects have now become a reality. We have investment funds that go for fertile land. So that means they will not go for land that is not fertile because it has no productivity or not sufficient. So it's not, it doesn't give the profit. So from this point of view, I see this as a positive situation. Of course, one has to see that this is not overburdening. And the same problem is with land grabbing. It shows that there is an economic aspect to it. Now, we need regulation. I really think that we need, at least in some context, regulation. And the question always was, with soil protection, as with, let's say, nature protection or conservation, how can you include this dynamics of soil development? You know, to have a concept that allows for development, because we don't want to preserve a soil at a specific development stage. We want to keep it to be manageable and to be fertile and productive on a sustainable basis. And I think now we have a concept. I said it this morning, we have this concept of soil functions. So I can give you an example, or try to give you an example. You cannot, it might be a good idea that we would like to freeze ourselves at a certain life stage. You know, don't want to become older. It will not work, as we all know, unfortunately. So, but the functions that you need, for instance, that your heart is beating, that the blood is circulating, you need this from the very moment that you are born until the end of your life. So these functions are very important. And this concept we have now also implemented from the soil scientific point of view, that these functions must be fulfilled, and if they are not fulfilled, you have to think about what you can do. So I think we have the scientific concept, we have this global aspect of many aspects, and we have the pressure from economic point of view. And therefore, we need regulation, we need to act, and it's the time for soil related questions that we have today. So I think it's our time now.
So we had 3 hands up. We had Mr. Flasbart, then we have Mr. Müller, and Professor Töpfer. So I'm going to let Mr. Flasbart, because he's going to be leaving us soon, so I'm going to let him take the word first. Apologies.
Thanks for that. Usually it should not be an advantage if you are so unpolite to leave earlier, but thanks a lot. Yes, I'm really happy with the statement of Reinhard Hüttl. First, I thought I would have to challenge what he said when he was, in my understanding, a little bit too positive about investment funds being engaged in land deals or land grabbing. But with your addition, we need regulation. I'm absolutely fine. Then it makes sense. And I just want to underline what has been said earlier, that it is really a huge challenge we are facing. It's not about just, or as a way around, getting zero net land degradation is already a huge challenge. But land and soil degradation, Alex moved it from land to soil degradation, is something different. If you have the land, it doesn't say at all whether it's really full fertile soil on the land. So we have to develop more understanding, more common understanding, yes, and in the end also more regulation on what sustainable land use practices are about. And there I agree, of course we need implementation, as Braulio says, but you also need a set of some rules of common understanding what sustainable land use is. And 20 years after Rio 1, we are galaxies away from sustainable land use around the world. So what is really needed is a number of criteria and really manageable rules for land use. And then this is step number 1 for implementation as step number 2.
Mr. Müller, very briefly, before I go to Professor Töpfer.
I think 90 or 100% of all people here share the view that the challenges are growing and the demands are increasing. And I strongly believe that any policies who are not linking the fight against degradation to production will fail, or to say it in a positive way. We have to recognize that the demand will grow, especially in Africa. The African population will grow by 2 billion till the end of the century. So there is no way of looking only, and I have an environmental background, only from a protection point of view to soil management. We have to link it to sustainable production. And therefore I see 3 or 4 issues where we have to concentrate. First, we need secure tenure systems. Without secure tenure systems, that's a broad issue, people will not have an interest in sustainability because they are only interested in short terms. The second is we need knowledge, extension, good practices, so that information, data, knowledge is available for farmers to be applied. The third issue is we need investment, but investment in sustainable production. Investment alone doesn't mean a lot. And the fourth issue is, and this is highly political, is there a need, or do we agree on a governance system on what means sustainable production? We have a 10 years debate in the UN system on sustainable consumption patterns and sustainable production. If you talk to 5 people, you get 6 different answers. What does this mean? And therefore, to concentrate on a framework of sustainability related to these problems and linking it to tenure, to knowledge, and to investments, I think this could be seen as the way forward. However, we have to convince our member countries that this is not only additional regulation, this is a step forward to feed a growing population.
Professor Töpfer?
I want to come back a little bit to the question, is that more or less a problem for the South and not for the North? It's a nice idea. We have our hands fine. I'm a little bit skeptical. You know, with regard to the water agenda, there was a development that they have also virtual water. That's not the water we have here, but what we import with our products. Coming from China, they now use the language of gray CO2 emissions, saying they are producing products for the Western markets and the CO2 emissions are calculated for them. I only mentioned it. At the end of the day, we have to ask the same question with regard to soil. That's what I want to start also discuss a little bit more. And if you have this development, then the per capita consumption on soil in the western part, the northern part, is much higher than in the southern part. So the question, how do we handle this? Can we reduce our soil-related demand in products? Seems me to be a very, very important part to discuss. And it is not by chance. You see, I have to criticize myself. I was an Undersecretary General of the United Nations in the year 2000 when we prepared the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals are missing 2 important words, energy and soil. Energy and soil is not a single time mentioned in the Millennium Development Goals. But these Millennium Development Goals were more or less the goals developed from the north for the south. And this is a bias, and therefore I don't want to go in the direction and say, forget it here. Our main problem is other places far away. What I learned as a politician is that the problem is even more important the more far away it is from your responsibility. You accept it. You can see it in biodiversity. You can see it wherever. And therefore, we have to go a little bit also closer in our lifestyle, in our handling of those things. Therefore, we decided to go tomorrow evening to this dinner, where we can hopefully prove and show it what is a soil you need for the production of 2 kilos of a steak, and what is the soil necessity for the production of grain. So you have a little bit what we discussed already in water, I know, but it is not known at all in this field of soil. When I mention this in our rural area, but your cattle are grazing everywhere, but not in Germany, they don't believe it. But it is a matter of fact. And therefore, I come back, yes, there are lots of problems in the African region. Being 8 years responsible for UNEP, headquartered in Nairobi in Kenya, you have a little bit of feeling what is really a problem, but nevertheless, don't make it too easy and say, not really our problem, mainly problem of other people.
Mr. Falkenberg, and then we'll get Mr. Knukovic also involved in the discussion.
I think Two things I want to say. If I came across as saying it's not a problem for the North, then I was misunderstood. What I was trying to say is that the different pressures, because there's not only food pressure on soils, there are different pressure on soils. And a zero degradation target in Europe, zero net target in Europe is easier to achieve than in a part of the world where all of the infrastructure is not there and where all of the demographic pressure is taking place. That was my point for the moment. Your point of calculating the virtual land use and the virtual water use and the virtual CO2 emissions is a different aspect, one that one could also discuss more in depth, but one that I find a lot more complicated, because basically it is lifting the good old polluter pays principle. I was for some time I was involved directly also in climate change negotiations, and I had this Chinese argument that their CO2 emissions are not really their CO2 emissions, but because they are an exporting country, they're really the CO2 emissions of the United States and Europe. I don't know any European consumer who asks products that he buys and that have been imported from China to have been produced by using dirty coal energy. So the responsibility for the way in which you produce has to stay with the producer. You can produce beef, you can produce the feed stuff for animals in developing country in either sustainable manners or in unsustainable manners. And those choices are very much, first and foremost, local. I'm talking from an EU perspective, so I should be careful and not arguing too much for the local aspect of soil, because I want to regulate soil at European level. But I do have to recognize that there's obviously a very strong local element, and the ways in which we can come up with solutions will have to differ. There are common threads. None of us should go beyond this zero net degradation path. But how we do this, there can be a lot of individual answers in a lot of different individual realities. And I think we need that flexibility. We have in Europe, we have regulation on the table. Jochen and others here on the panel know this. The key resistance in Europe against a European-wide solution on soil is what? Is A, the kind of ideology, the soil is a national issue and no one else has to bother with it. That's just basic philosophy or national ideology or whatever you want to call it. One can deal with it. The second is more economic, a resistance of those who sit on contaminated soil to actually create transparency about the contamination of their soil, because that means my soil is worth less money. So I have an economic loss that I fear if there is any regulation in Europe that would impose transparency on the quality of soil that exists. If an industrial area, an old historic industrial area, is solidly polluted, contaminated, it obviously has very different value than if it is not. That knowledge across Europe, across our European map, is not known, is not readily available. It's one of the points on which, when you go beyond the ideology, we are arguing, we're fighting. And then we are fighting about the agricultural practices. All of our farm lobbies, and the funny thing is particularly that one of Germany, where there is soil regulation, there is German soil regulation, they are arguing against any form of sustainable agricultural practice. And the strange thing in this is that while we would have the possibility of creating European-wide conditions for how you have to do sustainable agriculture through a soil directive. We're now having to do it via agricultural policy, via our European agricultural policy, where we're talking precisely of the same things, introducing conditions under which farms should be run, upon which they would get European taxpayers' money. If you don't green, if you don't move to sustainable farming practices in the next financial period throughout Europe, there will no longer be public support for that activity. And that's a very powerful tool that we can use in Europe to make sure that we effectively move forward. But there are economics, and that's why I'm coming to the economics all the time. And the same no, it's not the same economics, but there are economics also at work in developing countries. But we need to understand the individual economics if we want to come up with the right answers. And I'm really not convinced that it is a one-fits-all.
Mr. Ganacha, I'm sure you have a response to that.
Yes. In addition to what Carl has said, I would like to highlight that coming out from Rio, where head of state called for the need to strive to be the land degradation neutral world, the question is, because that is a kind of general purpose, what could be the goal for all? Because when you say zero net land degradation by a given date, that is a target, that's almost a target. So I think the goal might be something like sustainable land use for all and by all, being in agriculture, energy, urbanization, or whatever. Because you see nowadays, fertile soil has become a kind of strategic asset, lacking any kind of regulation. And at the same time, degradation is driven very often by misplaced investment, incentives, and policies. How do we get them right? It doesn't mean the same thing in the developing countries as in the developed countries. But I'm not quite sure that it will be easier in the developing countries. It will be difficult on both ends. But we have no other choice. Because as those resources are shrinking, our ability to withstand climatic shocks is also shrinking. And this is something that is common to all of us. So it's not just about food. Our forests are also shrinking. So if we really want a global response, that is sound, that is responsible, where we will build a kind of accountability framework or regulation framework, then yes, we have to agree to have a sustainable land use for all and by all as a goal and agree on a target. And translating the target in sub-targets in Europe might mean something else. And in Africa or in Latin America might mean something else.
Mr. Konakevich, I want to get you involved in this discussion. I mean, apparently there is a divide and a discrepancy between different methods and different ways of seeing things. How do you respond to the different visions that have been presented here?
Well, first of all, I'd like to remind everybody that so that in Germany we already have something like a zero-net soil regulation. If local communities put land into use for housing, infrastructure, industry, or whatever, take land out of natural use or farming and put it into any use that has to do with building, the communities have to provide a compensation. They have to take something out of use somewhere else. So here is the principle. It may be very weak. It may not be sort of not be definitely effective, but it is there, and it has an impact on the local level. By the way, that was put into law when Klaus Töpfer was minister responsible for planning and building in Germany in 1996, and it has been a turning point. At least for the perspective on the local level and among planners, sort of about the value of soil. So I think that here is an important experience that we can refer to, and it definitely points to the value of good regulation here. And it also points to the importance of implementing it on the local level. And here, of course, we are talking about sort of the various levels of regulatory intervention. And I see a wide agreement here that we need regulation, and some would like to see the regulation on the global level. Karl Falkenberg would like to see the regulation on the European level. I'm not against global. I'm sure there are members in the European Union that would like to see it on the national level. I think we have to carefully reflect on the experiences of the past. What can help us on the global level? I don't believe it's regulation. I think it's awareness raising, and it's sort of the political agenda. There is a global political agenda, very obvious. You can, when you go to New York late September and the week before the General Assembly, you look at the various events there, and you have the political agenda of the year, the global political agenda of the year. So it's very important to put it on that political agenda. The regulatory steps, I think, would rather have to be on the regional or national level, very much closer to implementation. But I think we all deplore the lack of awareness. Why is that so? I can compare it to the climate field. It's very different in the climate field. We have a very high attention for climate issues. I think here the global interlinkages are much more obvious than they are in the soil area, much more obvious. The global interlinkage, why does soil change in Africa affect us in Europe and vice versa, or in India and vice versa and so forth, are much harder to describe and even much more difficult to understand, but they need to be understood. So how does the political system work to create awareness? Two issues. One is the economics of it. The economics of it, if you can convince leaders that it makes sense, economic sense, and perhaps even fiscal sense. I mean, that's really ambitious. Fiscal sense to go forward in the area, it's a very strong argument. And the other important argument is risk. How do you deal with risk? Risk management, and that's maybe even more powerful than the economic argument. And I think on this soil issue, we can very well play on both of these elements. And I think that needs to be done, and I think we all need to be more effective on that. When it comes to action, regulation, I very much agree with Alexander Müller with his 4 points where the action is needed. I think tenure is perhaps one of the most important things, because sort of tenure influences the calculus, the calculus of each individual landowner, smallholder, farmer, or whatever. If we don't have secure tenure, nobody is interested in the long term. So, I can also say that from the experience of our German Development Corporation, it's ambitious because it requires a change in the legal attitude, It's technically ambitious too, but the technical part is really easy. The technical part you can take care of with a lot of money and technology. But it's sort of the approach that needs to be changed, and that's the hard thing.
So I had, again, 3 fingers raised, so who am I going to pick? Okay, we're going to keep it very brief. Mr. Müller, Mr. Flossbarth, and then Professor Hüttel, and then we'll go back this way, and then we have to go also to Professor Töpfer. Go ahead.
We have started in the last 10 minutes of 20 minutes the question, what is the appropriate level for regulation? I would agree with Manfred that awareness raising at the global level is important, but I would go beyond. I strongly believe that there's a need for a global agreement on principles, norms, and standards on sustainable soil management. to be implemented and to be worked out at the national level, and then at the local level with all stakeholders really enforced. So the global level, as we did with our voluntary guidelines, has to agree on principles. And as long as we do not have an agreement on principles at the global level, every country has a different approach to sustainability. Why is this wrong? At least from a food production or from a food system perspective, food systems are since many years not a national issue. We are interdependent at a global level. And what goes wrong in one area of the world will immediately have an impact in other areas of the world. So the interdependency requires setting of principles. And then we have to spell out what does this mean for the national level and for the local level. A second issue, let's not forget consumers. Consumers are driving the demand. And if we can, over a longer period, change consumer behavior, then we have immediately an impact. Currently, we are throwing away 1.3 billion tons of food every year in developing countries and developed countries for different reasons. But if you're looking at the consumers and the retailers, there is a huge potential for using less land because we are throwing away fertile soil, land, water, everything, energy, without really using it. So let's look at the different levels and let's try to develop a strategy from global to local level where we address issues of sustainability.
I think we have...
Professor Töpfer agrees, by the way.
Pardon?
He agrees. He wanted to clap. Go ahead.
Starting point.
I mean, I think we have two basically different problems. One is what Manfred Konopkiewicz addressed, and that is that we are losing land for any kind of infrastructure. I believe that this is definitely more or less a domestic issue. And I don't believe that what we are doing, for example, in Germany, that we are losing around roughly 100 hectares each and every day for infrastructure is not the final stage of intelligence. In a shrinking economy, driving more and more to the third sector with services and so on and so forth. But the second issue for the global debate is, in my view, much more important, and that is the unsustainable use of land. And there I'm completely with Alexander Müller. Yes, we need standards. I know that it is not the high time for a new international big convention and so on and so forth, but at least we should start to discuss in the direction of this kind of standards. Look at our bioenergy standards we have introduced in Europe. I think we are we have reached quite something in this area. Of course, there are still some issues like indirect land use matters, but still we have a set of standards. But we are addressing only a very small part of the land production, of the biomass production, just for bioenergy. Why? Because there was a lot of pressure into this direction, because societies didn't accept bioenergy instead of food. But what we need is much more standards for our day-by-day biomass for food and feed we are trading around the world. And that is, I think, the link between what has been said by Klaus Töpfer and Karl Falkenberg. I mean, those who buy something, the consumers, even those who buy food for the big traders, maybe they don't know enough about the standards in the respective countries. So we have to go for this kind of standards.
Maybe they don't care. That could be another question. But Professor Töpfer, please.
Perverse reaction. The higher the standard at home, the higher the probability that this function is exported. That was what I mentioned in the beginning. So if we are coming to something like a soil leakage, then we have a real problem. And again, you can make wonderful solutions at home with the consequences that they are exported and the products are imported. Therefore, I underlined it again and again. And with regard to, I'm very happy with global solutions. We have a nice saying in those days in UNEP, where we're saying if we had ham, we could produce ham and eggs if we had eggs. What I learned in all my professional life was simply, there are lots of people running around, important politicians, and say, we want to have a taxation on CO2 and whatever. And it's the last sentence at the end they say, and this on the global level harmonized. And with this last sentence, they say we don't want to have it. Because, you see, the time, it is a matter of fact, the time of legally binding solutions is gone. I had the pleasure to negotiate those on the global level, like the POPs Convention or the Cartagena Protocol, or name them. And the more difficult it is, by the way, the lower the standards are. I'm very convinced we have the same problem with climate. As long as you cannot go to the next climate negotiations with the energy technology environmentally friendly with regard to CO2 on the same price level as the fossil fuels, you can negotiate as long as you want to have it. Those who need development will, of course, use the energy, the cheapest one. Therefore, it is so important that we try to make better solution for soil or better solution for energy. Therefore, I intervened a little bit in this direction, because I'm really afraid that at the end of the day, we go in a direction and say, but fine, everything good, and what is coming in, we are even praising ourselves, saying, but this gives economic backing to other nations. And therefore, I'm very close to Manfred's consideration, start with a little bit more awareness raising, and if at the end of the day, Alexander, your nice, not legally binding procedure is successful, fine. But if you say we need a binding agreement on the global level, we will not reach it.
I was not arguing for a legally binding agreement. We won't get any. I was arguing for agreed principles at voluntary level, and no, we have the experience with our voluntary guidelines on land tenure. We would never have got it as a legally binding principle, and now we have for the first time an international agreed set of principles and standards how to deal with land considering good governance. And we have to learn from this experience. It will be very difficult, the trickling down effect, we know how difficult it is. But I don't see any other way than to set up an independent panel of experts advising this process and then agreeing on standards. Otherwise, we will always continue to advocate and to raise awareness, and the world is getting in a different direction. So the combination between voluntary guidelines and action on the ground, I think that's the only way forward.
I'm going to allow Professor Hüttel and then Anjan Datta, and you'll get very briefly as well, and then I'm going to open the floor to the audience. Go ahead.
First of all, I would like to say from a scientific point of view, soils are soils. Of course, we have different soils, they're in different developmental stages. And therefore, a more common awareness and understanding of what sustainable aspects are concerned, I think could be achieved. I don't think it's, maybe in Europe we need regulation, in other areas this might be different, but there must be this backing by scientific findings, and I think we are there, we can do this. But from my point of view, this economic aspect is also relevant, because if soils are becoming more and more visible as a limited resource, it might be much more attractive to not just have sustainable land use on the soils that we have right now, but also bring back soils that have been degraded. There is a lot of soils around on this planet that we could use if we would bring it back. And therefore, I liked your word, Klaus Töpfer, this morning on soil engineering. You know, that might be something that could be utilized in when we have these aspects of soil functions, of sustainable fertile soils, that could add to this problem of scarcity and of the discussion that we have. My personal belief is that trying to change the behavior of people is not so easy. That's another aspect that I would like to make, that takes time. I mean, we have been seeing this with smoking, for instance. It really takes a lot of time. But there also it's true, the first step in the right direction is important. But I think if you combine these situations, you could probably be successful.
Anjan Datta, please.
Well,
I think I agree that the whole awareness question is very important, and maybe we should move towards more voluntary initiative and action point and agenda setting rather than binding. But what I would also like to argue that the whole question of soil and this whole soil management and degradation issues at the New Rate, I think we should see it in also not necessarily only the south and north division, but also we should see in the context of in the rural economy and the whole urbanization process, which is very important, because both is impacting in two different ways, and we'll have to deal with two sets of issues here, and the barriers of change and drivers of change are very different in each scenarios. So that's something we should probably think of. How do you address the whole transformation of the rural economy, and how do you sort of influence the whole urbanization process? And it's a total urbanized world now. More than 50%, 52% people live in urban area. And the second question is, I think, also like how do you address? I mean, we talked about two I here, but I think I would also like to put another I. That okay, we need the information and we need the ideology, which is also sort of sometimes pushes us for action, sometimes also assists us to act. And that's basically the inertia, which lead to. So basically the TI is very important. We need the information. Do you have that information? We have fragmented information. This morning, even Mr. Alexander Muller made us aware even some of the science are very outdated. So we need those information. And we need to come out of that, the ideological mode which we are in. That's one area. And hopefully, if we can address these two I, the third I will be removed as well, inertia of action, inaction. And that inertia of inaction or action will be stimulated by the whole comprehensive economic analysis. Because even, climate change we are talking about, but until Stern report came out, what was the attention of that? So that's very, very fundamental issue that we'll have to do those economic analysis of the whole soil question. And otherwise, it will remain outside the radar screen of the political discussion, I'm afraid.
I'm going to have Mr. Ganache make a very brief statement, and then I have 3 questions already up, so then I'll open the floor to the audience.
Yes, thank you. Just to recall that both degradation and rehabilitation are site-specific, but with global impact or benefit. That's why it is difficult to bring people to agree on precisely doing those things for local reason at local level and still delivering global benefit. So to the 3 points of action that Alexander Muller highlighted, I would like to add a 4th one. He said tenure, knowledge, and investment. There's a 4th point which is about assessment and monitoring. If we do not get there, we might be still believing that we're doing the right thing and nobody will be tracking. Are we in the right direction? And what else is needed versus what is known? So I think that not only assessing land degradation and potential for restoration is important, but also ensuring that we have in place a very dynamic monitoring system tracking progress made towards sustainable use.
So definitely a lot of food for thought. I'm going to go with the first gentleman here, and then the gentleman over there, and then all of you.
Is this work? Yeah.
Can you briefly introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I am Eduardo Viola, Professor of International Relations at the University of Brasilia, Brazil. Thank you very much for a very enlightened discussion. I would like to add 3 things. First of all, I agree completely with Alexander. The question of soil related to food is already a global issue. The fact that societies, public opinions in most of the society don't perceive as that, to the contrary, they perceive in a very narrow, nationalistic, old-fashioned, my territory, my national interest. The fact is that we all know how it all is the flows of food and soil and all what is produced by soil and energy, biomass, is very strongly global today. For that reason, I think it's very important, I agree exactly with Alexander, to have a global treaty in principles and rules. This treaty will be like the convention, not like the Kyoto Protocol. It's something very soft law. It's a global principles that people could enforce or not, but that creates a kind of cultural, civilizational approach to reality that say soil is something that we need to conserve. Okay, this is like it's already happening with climate. The situation is bad, but it would be much worse if we wouldn't have an cultural agreement, civilization agreement that only not shared maybe by some part of the American population, that the climate change is a very strong issue for humanity. Second point is, and this is a criticism to all of you, is a mistake to continue thinking in this issue, like in many other issues, in developed and developing countries. Why? Because here the variables that are relevant are others. First of all is the scarcity or abundance of topsoil. For societies countries that are scarcity of topsoil, this is already a relevant problem. It's not remote. For societies that have an abundance of soil, maybe they don't care about. Second point is societies that have more long-term and global responsibility versus societies that are short-term, narrow nationalistic responsibility. This is another parameter to combine with the first. And the third one would be societies that have own agriculture technologies, sustainable agriculture technology, so societies that had invested significantly in this, and the other kind of society. If you compare all these parameters, you will find a potential coalition of countries, like-minded countries, that could build up a convention, could constrain other countries to build up a treaty that would be soft law anyway. But something that is very relevant, that in all countries will be conservative and reformist. For example, Brazil has an abundance of soil, has for sure a lot of conservative, but also has a lot of reformist-oriented people because of their long-term approach. And in our society you will find. So this will be also a transnational coalition among reformist forces, let's say. So with this you can build up a coalition for a convention that will not solve the problem at all, but it would be relevant for having a new cultural civilization approach to soil. Otherwise, the whole idea of diffuse rising awareness is not enough. It's not enough.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Konakowicz, you wanted to respond to that, I saw you, and then we're going to go to the gentleman, please.
Yes, I think this is really focusing on the issue of the role of the global level. And I want to add some more considerations. Having been involved in so many global agreements and negotiations, I think I have a pretty good perspective on the value and on the limitations. Limitations are pretty strong. The value, of course, is global recognition, the global political agenda, but then the limitations. We know how difficult existing global agreements are to develop further and to implement. We know how long it has taken for the climate for the climate convention to really agree on further steps, and how tenuous the progress is that we have in hand. Now I see over the past 10 years, I see some of the global communities turn to global goals, and the biodiversity people have decided on their global goals. The energy people are now sort of working on the global goals relating to energy. My impression is that they have not been very effective. When it comes to political decision making and budgets, that really doesn't have a lot of leverage in the governments, because it's not sort of, it's part of it's come out of a professional community mainly that has set their own goals, and of course very ambitious targets, because they all have in mind the more ambitious our targets are, the more resources we will get a couple of years later. These resources have not come. So why is that so? I think one of the problems of global agreements is that they imply the notion that there are global beds to be distributed. And that was very much for many years, the approach towards climate issues. I think the general idea was we have to change, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be a burden on everybody, and nobody is going to take the first step unless we all agree on burden sharing. So that was for many years. Nobody started. Now the perspective has changed. Some countries have learned that perhaps there may be an advantage in being the first one, in being the front runner. And so some countries have agreed or have decided on initial steps without a global agreement. So the idea of a global agreement, a burden sharing of global beds is in a way out. And I think that's a very, very important intellectual step. And I think that step also needs to be taken on the soil issue. It's not in a disadvantage to be the first one, to be the front runner, to be a leader in policy, to be a leader in action. It's actually an advantage, or let's put it this way. It must be structured in a way that it is an advantage. And then let the others learn and follow suit. And they will follow suit pretty well.
I'm going to have Professor Töpfer
only one sentence. You know, I was once in Rio 1992, responsible for the negotiation on non-legally binding principles on all kinds of forests. And we succeeded. And I followed these principles, as you may imagine, if you are a little bit in the role of a father for this. And I'm not convinced that they are the most influencing principle at all. We have a forest forum now in New York and all this. I love the idea. It would be good. But then let us study and let this be a result of our meeting that, for example, ESS or FAO or somebody else, or together, we go through the non-legally binding principles, what kind ever, and ask, when can they be successful? What are the preconditions for this? Because otherwise we are very soon in a wonderful blue sky in heaven, but we have nothing on earth. And that makes me a little bit concerned. Therefore, to study this seems me a reasonable outcome already now for our work.
The gentleman who's been very patient, yes, please take the word.
Patrick Holden, Sustainable Food Trust, a new organization promoting the transition towards more sustainable food systems. And prior to that, I was head of the UK Soil Association for 15 years. I wanted to say first that I strongly agree with what you said as moderator, that we need to communicate with the public emotionally to help them to connect with soil. But what I want to speak about for this question is as a farmer, because I'm in my 40th year of having stewardship over a piece of land in Wales, and I started right from the beginning to try to farm according to sustainable principles as best I could use them. And I think Alexander Muller's made a very important point about the need for definitions, because unless we define what we mean by sustainability, we'll be talking in tongues. But what I've found, to cut straight to the chase, is that there isn't yet a business case for the adoption of farming methods which build for soil fertility, which I think is what we're going to need, not just to stop degradation, but actually to build soil fertility. And until there is an economic case, until there is an enabling economic and policy climate, you're not going to get large-scale uptake. So it seems to me that one of the aims of this very important event would be to set up a group that would be looking at various incentives and disincentives, so it would mean carrots and sticks, and it's great that the Director General of the Environment is here, Environment Commission, because obviously this is part of the package, which would collectively mean that farmers in Europe and in the developing world had an economic incentive to adopt soil carbon stewardship measures. And that's what I would like to suggest should be one of the outcomes of this event.
And do you have a question maybe for one of our panel members?
I would be very interested to hear, particularly from the Director General, as to whether he thinks that that is a possible approach, and whether there would be an appetite amongst the other panelists for looking at this, because unless you get uptake by farmers, however much we discuss this, it's not going, the change isn't going to happen.
Do you want to take that, Mr. Falkenberg, very briefly?
I think the idea of a business case is a very good one. I several times here already talked about addressing the economics, and the economics can not only be macroeconomics, but they have to address the micro level. They have to address the individual enterprise at the farming level. So I think it's a very interesting idea. I don't see the full-fledged business case myself. I think we need to invest in this. We need to look into this, and there are from biodiversity there are a number of elements that could come into it. There could be elements related to habitat banking, etc. But we need to link it also to the overall land use. I don't think that we can solve the problem if we only look at a business case for agrarian land or agriculturally used land. We need to have a business case overall for our land, and that to me starts a little bit as in water. We have in the European Union, we have just released a blueprint for water, and one of the fundamental ideas there is to say we need water accounts. We need in every European river, we need to have a river management plan that sort of brings into balance the amount of water that is regularly produced within that river basin, and the different callers, the different uses, whether urban, whether agriculture, whether industrial, etc. And I would like to think in terms of land use in pretty much the same area. I would want to have land accounts where we set targets for the different uses, where we map out in our respective areas how do we see the allocations, and develop from there specific business cases for the different activities. But it's extremely complicated to do this simply in Europe, where we have very elaborate ownership rules, etc. And it becomes extremely more complicated if you go into areas where tenure, where land ownership is completely open, and where therefore addressing these issues is yet another challenge. But fundamentally, I think you're absolutely right. We will be successful in anything that we do only if we take the operators, if we take the respective communities along.
I'm going to take another question that we have here. Who has the mic here? Yeah, go ahead, gentlemen.
Uriel Safriel, I'm an ecologist from Israel. I want to add something to the responses that you had on your first question today, why soil does not receive the attention that it should. We've heard several times here today that soil is a finite resource, that it is a non-renewable resource. But this is also true for energy, for fossil energy, exactly the same. They are finite resource and non-renewable. Yet soil did not reach the attention as the fossil energies. And the reason is that in spite of soil being, on top of soil being non-renewable and finite, it is also not consumed. And therefore, people see always the soil, even if it is degraded, even if it is, much of it is not there. Only in extreme cases of erosion, people realize that the soil disappears. And we hear figures of this amount of billions of tons of soil that are eroded, but we hear this only in our family. And people really don't hear that. And even if they hear that, they don't see it. They don't see these billion things in some place that being suddenly dumped into somewhere. So this is the difficulty in explaining people what is the problem with soils. And I think it is a matter of awareness. Climate change and climate also did not have enough awareness at the beginning. It was a lot of work to make people aware for the issue of climate. Biodiversity is way, way out. Most people actually on the world don't know why they have to protect biodiversity. If you really ask them, they will tell you it is a nice thing, and not more than that. So we have work to do about the awareness, and also about the globality of the issue. For example, I guess that most people in many countries do not know how much of the food they eat comes from a different country. No knowledge at all about that nearly. We know that, but people don't know. So the awareness is very important, and I want to finish my intervention that also in my culture, from where I come, the awareness comes only, unfortunately, at the end of the day of a person. That when he is buried, the cantor says to the dead person, from soil you came, and to soil you now return.
Well, we hope with this event to avoid that, to avoid that stage. So if I can ask you to pass on the mic to the front, please. And then I'll come to you.
My name is Ephraim.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
My name is Ephraim Konya from the International Food Policy Research Institute. Something which Uriel just talked about is that land should be in the headlines so that it can turn heads and people will invest. But we need to have it in the headlines only when we have very good science that is compelling. It's telling the people, what are you losing? Just telling them how many tons you're losing in the ocean, so what? That doesn't make much sense. But if we can talk about the economics of land degradation, and we make very good empirical evidence, very compelling, and it goes in the headlines, then we'll see a lot of investment. And a good example is the climate change. It was not in the headlines in the past. It came in the headlines, and we saw investment.
Yes, we have that. But thank you so much for that point. Now I'm going to give the floor to the gentleman up here in front. Yes, sir.
My name is Yaya Olaniro. I'm the Nigerian PAM rep to the Rome-based agencies, and I also chair the World Food Committee on Food Security. The voluntary guideline thing has come at a time when everybody thought it would not come. It took 5 years, as Alexander Muller said, for the conception, and 3 years of negotiation. Now, a number of people have said, why should it be voluntary? An attempt not to make it voluntary almost killed it. So we opted for the voluntary. But what is significant is that you have all stakeholders involved in the debate, in the argument, and so on. Now, basically, what we have succeeded in doing is that all the countries of the world happened to be part of it. The civil society was there. The private sector was there. The academia, the various organizations in terms of professionalism, agriculture, fisher folks, foresters, were all there under the same roof, agreeing and disagreeing. There were days we walked out of the place not talking to each other. But eventually we came back to say, look, I think your argument is superior. Let's move forward. Now, what we have succeeded in doing is to have a global, overarching document adopted by the world. But we emphasize the fact that it has to be locally implemented. taking care of the local laws and the acts of the people. What is the main advantage? There are millions of women, other farmers, that have no right to land. This is a document that governments will willingly look at and work upon. It's not going to be easy. I don't want us to deceive ourselves. The implementation is also going to be very critical. And unless we look at it that way, we will not be able to come here and smile. Now, two other points. That soil has not been in the forefront as it ought to be is as a result of probably what we are still doing here. The converters are all here. We need to take, like we'll do in my village, the trumpet and go out there to call everybody to the village square and tell them why there's need for soil. The mother of all natural resources should be understood. Finally, and this is to any member of the panel who wants to answer it, I am very, very afraid of something. And that is, the world seems to be driving probably the remaining part of the world, Africa, that has anything to reserve in terms of land to the cliff. If we keep drumming the fact that by 2050, we'll have 80% of the population, which would have increased by 2.5 billion in big cities, then this is dangerous. What can we do now to keep people in the villages? Infrastructure, electricity, which the organizer told us was missing in the first MDG document. If you keep people with electricity, clinics, schools in the villages, we will preserve the soils, the conservation will go on, and then we will not run into the difficulty of mining in big scales that will not restore the degraded land, nor that of big farming. Thank you.
I'm going to seize on your comment about women because I got my first woman question there. I'm really sorry, gentlemen. I really appreciate you too, but I want to get a lady in here because else it's going to be very one-sided, and women are very important, I think, in this discussion, if not one of the most affected ones.
Yeah, I'm Violette Geissen from Wageningen University, and I'm here as a scientist, and I think it was a very interesting discussion. And I think we have two main things to think about, maybe. One is how can we reach the public? And that is a thing, I think, talking about the example of smoking. In between 1.5 years, in Europe, nobody smokes inside anymore. People agree it's bad to do this. They stand outside in the coldness smoking. And it's good for everybody. So I ask myself, if we could make the same effort in the media and television, radio, to get the soil as such an important subject and sustainable land use as such an interesting topic for the people, with the help of communication people who would say us how to transmit our message to the public in a professional way, I think we could be a step further. And another thing is, what I was thinking about today, we were all talking about sustainable land use, sustainable agriculture, but do we all agree what we are talking about? Many people are talking about soil erosion, but what about soil pollution caused by application of pesticides, other chemicals, veterinary products on the soils? Do we know what happens? Why are these products still in use worldwide, where we know which effect they have? Would it be good to work together with the organizations who produce these products to see how can we there in this way as well come to a sustainable solution? And how could we as scientists define what is sustainable and what not, and then go to the public.
So I think there's a lot of remarks and thoughts, and it's really nice. It's been very thought-provoking, but I want to include a question that we got from Twitter. So I just want to make sure that we get that in as well. As you know, we're having a live stream, so I want to get at least one Twitter question in there for our panel. Go ahead.
Hello. I don't know if you remember, but actually the whole event right now is being live streamed, so people are watching us all over the world. So please, panelists, do remember to smile because you're online. But what we do have is that one question from our Twitter followers, and because we wanted to reach out to the public, and actually they were very daring with their questions. They have very controversial views, and they want the panel to say something on the topic of biofuels and having soil resources as a very limited a thing and natural resource that we have. They want to know what you think in terms of soils for food production or soils for biofuels production. And we also have a question from our participants here that was put in the bowl in the back. And that gentleman actually wants you to say something about how we can ensure the right to land for the poorest of the poor, and if you have any opinions on land grabbing. And yeah, thank you.
Professor Hurtwell is really eager. He wants to get in there. Go ahead.
Well, we dealt with the question of biofuels in different organizations. And one has to know, at least for Europe, a little bit the background. It was mentioned by our colleague from the Commission that we had the times when we produced a lot of goods that we didn't really utilize sufficiently. We had much of milk and butter and meat. And then we had a time that agricultural practices were seen as set-aside programs, so that in very blank words, we paid the farmers not to produce anything. And this is, of course, not a good idea either. So, and then we came into this question, is there anything that we could need? And there was the question also in terms of climate change and other aspects, the fossil fuels, the problem with the CO2 emissions. And so one idea was, could we replace the conventional gasoline or diesel with biofuels? And so there was an appreciation that farmers could be part of this solution. And I think this was a quite correct development. But of course, then besides the biofuels for the automobile or for mobility, then we had the biogas, for electricity generation in the rural areas with regard to questions like decentralized renewable energy supply. And there were subsidies. And apparently, we have overdone it. And we have regulations. That means not only production here, but it means import from other areas, from Indonesia, palm oil, or from sugarcane, soya, from America, South and North, and so forth. And maybe we have not thought about these kind of international effects. And that's exactly what globalization and what soils also mean. You have these kind of effects. So they produce there, they cut down the forests or degrade the soils by huge palm plantations or huge sugarcane plantations or soya and so forth. So this is exactly the effect. So what we would have needed much more is let's say, benchmarks in exactly what was said by my colleague from the Netherlands. And what is sustainable land management? What does it mean? Is there a certificate? Of course, there are some approaches towards this question of certifying that is under sustainable land use practices and so forth. But from my point of view, I cannot really see that we have reached a sufficient level for this. And therefore, we have this dispute at the tank or the plate, what is relevant. And then, of course, if you have drought or shortage of agricultural production, you get prices that go up, and then the poor people could not afford the tortilla in Mexico, for instance. So all these things kind of come together, but they show we are a global market, and these soils are part of this globalization market. And therefore, I don't like this North and South discussion, because it's one global family, it's one planet. And if we destroy it there because we don't do it in a sustainable way, we have the problems here as well. So from this point of view, my final remark in this question is, And there we must say that we have still some deficits also in knowledge what regards the carbon budgets in soils. We really don't understand when are our soils, for instance, carbon sinks or carbon sources. You know, so we had a monitoring here in Germany, and we could not say are our soils really sinks or sources right now. So there is also research needed, particularly what the lower soil is concerned, not just the upper 30 centimeters, but a little bit deeper down, maybe even very deep down, because there's life there too, and this has something to do with gas production and so forth. So I would argue for a strong monitoring system in this case as well. But this question relates exactly to the point that soils are a global matter, and this is not a national. We have to implement it locally, of course, but the overall view is different.
Professor Töpfer? Soil is a global matter?
Only to echo some very concrete answers. You are convinced that if we are selling better, making campaigns, that will change. A little bit hesitating, but we try it. That we have here a partnership with Deutsche Welle is a step in this direction. That our wonderful moderator is from Deutsche Welle proves that this is a good decision. I can inform you again, what I mentioned this morning, when we started our press conference, there was one journalist. In the meantime, there are sitting 15, 20. And by the way, they're writing about this. That's very, very helpful. We had some cover in the TV. So it is true that we are here, also converted, what was mentioned. But at the end of the day, you need this as well to give a reason for reporting outside. And that is, by the way, also a good chance for other elements in such a meeting. Do we need something like the Global Soil Award? Shall we do it like this? Or do we have anything else to do? Therefore, we are so open for your recommendation. By the way, Karl Falkenberg mentioned that in Osnabrück we have a museum for soil. This museum is next door, and they have a mobile museum in front of the hotel. So we invited them. They are here, and I'm very happy about this. So I want to mention it. If you go to the hotel, on the right side, you see a car, and please give them a good backing so that they do it. I want to add a little bit to the question, what do we do with rural areas and the cities? No doubt, it is a huge challenge. And I believe, yes, we have to consider what do we do in the rural areas, but we have also to consider how do we change the urbanization process. I think it is as important as the other one. So already in 1992, when we prepared Rio, there was, I think, from UNDP, a big study on urban agriculture. And I'm fairly sure that my missing link in soil science is the question, what do we do with urban soils? How do we change it? You see, in my country it's especially important because we have a decrease of population. So we will have more and more space in agglomerations. How to use it better? What can we do also to bring city functions in the rural areas? That's the other side. You must bring the city to the rural areas, otherwise the people come to the cities. That is, I started my professional life in Brazil, and we made a study with regard to the influx of people to the big conurbations, to Rio and Sao Paulo. Later on, I was a minister, came back and I saw the results, where we planned something like satellite cities to block it. That was a city. That was a city. If you are not successful to bring city functions in the rural areas, you have the same mobility going on. So I only want to mention it, adding as well that in our institute we have one study of a wonderful staff member from Belgium, she is asking, do we have the chance to make closed, cycled, open cities? Can we also close the cycles of cities? For example, in handling of waste, in the question of water, and all this. When she came to me and asked to be with us, I was very hesitant because I was convinced cities must be open, but they must be open, but they have to solve their problems in the city. So I only want to underline how important it is to make this question not only a rhetoric question, but to echo a little bit all the others. Otherwise, we come to an end, and I'm the host, and I have to be silent.
Miller, and then I'll have a lady again. Go ahead.
I would like to come back to your first question. Why was this community not successful in convincing the public that soils is an issue? They are all converted, but they did not agree. There was always a discussion, what is more important or more threatening, land degradation or salinization, desertification or sealing off, food or environment, biodiversity or high yields, farmers or panda bears. And what I really hope from this discussion here is that we come to a joint platform where we agree on a way forward towards sustainability, taking into account everything. It was just impossible to communicate what is necessary and what is really important, because we had a common platform, but too many different points of views. And I really hope that the Global Soil Week can contribute to come to an agreement where we agree that in the end we can communicate at which level, global, regional, national, independent, what are the challenges, and by the way, giving the first concrete steps forward. And this is really what I think is needed.
Go ahead, and then I'm going to go to, because I have a question for you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's urgent for us to agree on what is sustainable, and agree on the standard, and agree on how to monitor it. If we fail, the market will still continue to move, not only in speculating on food, but also in grabbing land. And so it is really imperative that we agree on that, and that we bring sustainability to apply to all players, private sector, government, and all stakeholders. That is why from here, not only awareness raising, but clear action towards a common platform from the global to the local.
Can I just
please,
add,
yes, go ahead.
a word, because the whole debate has gone a lot in the direction of voluntary, sort of skepticism about what the global system can deliver in terms of real agreements, and let's go voluntary. Voluntary, the non-smoking in every building would not have been achieved. We would still have people smoking in here. I'm just very afraid if we seriously give up on defining rules that we all agree we are going to implement. Braulio's implementation. To implement, we need rules. And if these rules are not understood to be binding and to be implemented by everyone, they're definitely not going to be implemented. And if we don't get there, then I'm very sorry, but we're going to do too little, too late. We need to understand that we don't have another 100 or 150 years to deal with this problem until everyone on this world has totally understood the implications. We need to act now and to act decisively, because the real problems are going to happen in the next 30, 40 years of demographic growth. When we are in 2050 and we're still alive, then probably the demographic pressure is going to be reducing, and therefore we could hope that a number of the environmental pressures would also be decreasing. But the question is, will we get there, and in what state? And that we need to define now.
Anandata, I'm going to let you have a quick moment, and then I have 2-3 questions, and then I'm going to have to wrap it up.
Well, yes, I think the whole question of the communication and how do you communicate, and I think again we'll have to think that like the community, as a community we are talking about here, all the converts, fine, but one is communicating with the policymaker, because we need certain policies, and policies are not necessarily the voluntary stuff, and policies is always create entitlement and also restrict entitlement. So that's the both sides. So that's one set of things. And I think we should not also forget, because I think a number of speakers have mentioned that, how we communicate these science and our concerns with the real user of the resources. And that user community is again very differentiated. If you look at Africa, the whole female-led farming households and all the stuff, and Asia is very different compared to the Latin America. So that's also need to be, because I think this forum or this, according to Dr. Toffer's documentation, I read it is a process, but process I hope leads to a kind of creation of a platform where we can continue this dialogue and agree on a consensus document, the way forward, that how do you communicate at two different fronts, at the policy level and also at the level of the resource user. So that's very, very important. So we come out of this process by end of 2.5 days or 3 days, agree on creating a platform where we meet and create space for dialogue and debate so that we have that. And at the same time also, like, we're talking about why it is not in the MDG, fine, as this is passed, but why it should not be in SDG for that matter. And it is only 2015. Time is too short. So I think also this is the time this forum should come up with a very concrete action plan that, okay, how we strategize ourselves and define a common agenda which we as a community could pursue and engage ourselves with those who draft or who negotiate the SDG in post-2015.
I have 3 questions. I have the lady, I have the gentleman who's been waiting forever, and the gentleman in the corner also who's been very, very patient, but he's getting a little bit angry. So we're going to have the lady first.
Thank you very much. I'm Alex Toland. I'm from the Technical University of Berlin and also the co-chair of the German Soil Science Society's Commission on Soils in Society and Education. I'm the program director of the wonderful Soil Film Festival, which is running here at Kino Arsenal, just a few feet away. And I think when we talk about raising soil awareness, we have to look at other actors that can contribute to raising soil awareness. Film is a wonderful media, also arts and theater. I wanted to pick up on Professor Hüttel's definition of soil functions in Germany. Production, habitat, and regulatory functions. I think there's also a very important cultural function that soil plays, especially in cities, community gardening, urban agriculture. That's really a way of bringing people together, and this cultural aspect has to be addressed. And I'd like to hear any comments from the panel on the cultural relevance of soils. Thank you.
Can you save that for just 1 second? I'll just have, do you have a question for us? Yeah? If you can state your question so that way we can, go ahead, sir.
Albert Engel, Deputy Head of Sectoral Departments in GIZ. I believe what has been said several times this morning, that this event can put soil on the agenda. But how to put it there and how to keep it there, I was hoping for answers on that, and I'm not clear about that yet. I heard 3 different lines of arguments here in the discussion. The one is create an emotional awareness, attachment to the issue. That worked well with forest loss in Germany. It may work with rainforests, with whales, with dolphins. I'm a bit skeptical if the museum in Osnabrück will ever be among the most popular in Germany. The second line of argument, and sorry, the addressee for this approach would be the general public, general awareness. The second line of argument that I heard was see soil as an economic resource. Mainly Alexander Müller brought that in. Make people aware about the economics of proper land use or land degradation. So looking at creating incentives, making a business case. As you pointed out here, the main addressees of us would be those who use the land, not the general public. It would be farming communities, farmers, but also other land users. Now the third line that I heard was go for regulations and rules, and by creating those, you will capture the issue. The addressees here would be policymakers, either global level, national level, whatever. I'm not clear yet now what is our main approach, or is it a bit of everything? But strategy is about choices. So what is the main thrust, how we want to proceed? And if I add a small, quick last second question, what is our vision for soil use in 50 years from now? Are we aiming at reclaiming all the land that has been lost and putting it into sustainable use? Or are we perhaps looking into use it more intensively, efficiently, thereby freeing land for other purposes? In the extreme case, go the route of having our food coming from greenhouses. The tomatoes that we had at lunch, they were from greenhouses in the Netherlands, and they do not use a single piece of soil. They are grown on stone wool, by the way, imported from Germany. But so what is the direction? What is the main purpose? What is our vision? Perhaps a few words on that. Thank you.
So I've got two questions. Action plan, and which I thought was a really good question as well, was the community gardening, because that's a way that people can grow attached and feel a relationship with soil. But I'll leave that up to you. Whoever wants to take the question.
Just one word to the cultural function. Of course, I agree 100%, and we know this, and we have other functions soils should and do fulfill, mechanical functions, soils as an archive, of course, of history, of historic development, and also the cultural function. This morning, I just mentioned the three important ecological functions in my point of view, but I couldn't agree more, and this is certainly an important aspect to create awareness by this means. So I full agreement.
Action plan.
I want to pick it up also because I was very surprised to see an example of in Spain of something that here in Germany is quite common, which are the Schrebergärten, those communal gardening activities, but which I guess in Germany are not the hippest, youngest of our population who are busy there. It's rather more those that are preparing to return to the soil, as someone said. Someone said earlier.
Wants to disagree. Begs to disagree.
But I was very surprised to see in Vitoria-Gasteiz a place where this had really not been used at all under defining an environmentally sustainable city policy to create a place between the city and the countryside where the city was putting small pieces of land, very small pieces of land, for free at the disposal of the city dwellers in exchange for simply having done an exam on how they would grow whatever, vegetables or flowers, on their little spot of land. So they had to simply show that they had an interest, that they wanted to develop a skill, and then they were given a 5-year lease for that plot of land. And this was extremely popular, was a huge success story, and it was then even used to re-educate or to bring back into the society some people who have had problems, imprisoned, psychological problems, etc. So there seems to be a cultural reality here, but one that has culture in a very, very wide sense in terms of well-being of people. I think there is probably within the people who are living in our cities now a real demand for actually touching the dirt and the soil again. And I think that's an encouraging development.
And it's really changing. You only have to go to the former airport, Tempelhof, and there you can see urban gardening. And these are very different people than the ones you mentioned as the former Schrebergärtners. And there's also a gardening guerrilla in the meantime in the cities, using every square meter to plant something there. So maybe it's changing.
Okay. Professor Töpfer.
Listening to Karl Volkenberg, I'm very happy that I'm not the owner of a Schrebergarten. That's very, very helpful. Thank you very much for giving me this advice. I have to make sure that this does not change. But coming back to your question, you mentioned the broader public, the user, the politicians. They are not at all independent. You can change the political landscape if you can change the minds of the people. So if you are able to influence the broader public that this is a topic of importance, you will see that there's a reaction by politics. So they are very closely interrelated, and I even believe that the way via the broader public is better than directly to the politicians. And the same is going on also with regard to the user. I don't want to go. So I would be interested in this. Question on the vision, what do we have as a vision? My vision. First and foremost, you know the very important sentence of Helmut Schmidt, that those who has a vision shall go to the doctor. It's Helmut. Ban?
Those who have a vision problem.
Yeah, that seems to be also something like an alibi for action. If you have a vision, the long-term vision. And so I don't want to go in this direction, but in the concrete perspectives. And if you go there, I sincerely believe, and this should be also a question of our scientific activity in the future, I sincerely believe that we have to differentiate the different function of soils in substituting to other solutions. And you mentioned already that soil for food production is substitutable. You have the tomatoes there without a single gram of soil. And I'm fairly sure that this development may be not only limited to the tomatoes from the Netherlands. Other functions, like the carbon functions, to substitute seems me a little bit more risky. So I believe we have not only to mention there are different functions, there are competition between the functions, but also a question, do we have any substitutes for this function of soil, yes or no? So in this direction, I didn't come to a final conclusion, but I believe it would be helpful to ask a little bit those questions as well. Maybe that I'm too lazy and there is already a lot of scientific findings available. I don't want to question this, but this is maybe not a vision, but a recommendation on consideration where to go in the future. What are those functions we can maybe substitute in a world with 9 billion people?
Mr. Kanaja, you wanted to jump in there?
Yes, I will not dare speak about vision after what Klaus Topper have said, but I think we should at least aim at connecting every man living on planet Earth to the functions of soil and how they depend on it, and how therefore we should all be in charge of its sustainable use. We should aim at that and then have a systematic approach to awareness raising. It's about also having like people who are well known to invest their authority into advocating for soil. You see, when we all watch on Inconvenient Truth, it did a lot to bring understanding to climate change issues. The film of this morning is bringing a very complex issues related to soil to the general public. We need to do more and more of that. And also to bring a kind of, a good understanding of possible tipping point, so that people will relate to those tipping points in a way that will bring them to take action. I think that is something that we should really aim at. And one point on which we were discussing over lunch is the fact that in the past there have been also transfer of technology. And some of those transfer of technology has actually been very harmful in the developing world regarding sustainable use of land, like clearing all the agricultural land before or plowing, and all those things. Now we should be humble enough when we are talking about knowledge to also capitalize on traditional knowledge when we're talking about knowledge, and being humble enough when we step into a community before telling them what they should do to really understand why they are doing what they are doing the way they are doing it.
I'm going to give you now the question on the floor. Sorry for that. And I saw you nodding, so this was a really good segue. Go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed. I've got a point and a question. Before we need a different skill set to the scientists around the table. Sorry, I'm Paul Nathaniel, Professor of Engineering Geology at the University of Nottingham. When we know what our message is, then there's a different skill set to get it out to the rest of the world. It's the press, the media. There is a marketing campaign that needs to be done to get the message out there. But my question is about scale. We've talked about action at the global level, at the institutional European level, at the national, at the regional, at the local. What I haven't heard is any, until this comment just now, is any recognition that there is a bottom-up groundswell of interest through transition towns, through permaculture, the writings of John Seymour, the small is beautiful ideas. the world is much more noisy, much more variegated in its understanding and its commitment and its motivation than we have heard this afternoon. And I'm going to ask my question to the Director General. My question is, do you think you would have had a smoother ride with your Soil Framework Directive if it had been more performance-based? This is what we would like you to achieve, rather than specification-based, which is, this is how you are going to do it. Because I suspect, if I can put Germany to one side, that some of the other blocking minority countries in Europe would have backed you and supported you, because they're already doing many of the things that the directive seeks to mainstream across Europe. And I think the one-size-fits-all regulation is probably too complicated and too slow and too cumbersome a tool to achieve the objectives that you gentlemen have all largely agreed on. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Should I come in immediately?
Yeah.
I mean, let me start slightly oddly with climate change, because it's something that is often referred to here also, and often you sense a little bit of jealousy. Climate change, there's awareness, and we've done things, and we've even had a Kyoto Protocol at some point in time, and all that is fine, and I'm not going to say anything against it. But when I look at the reality, Europe has capped its CO2 emissions, and no one else in the world. And Europe is just responsible for less than 10% of the CO2 emissions on this planet. And this planet is on the way of not hitting the agreed by all target of 2 degrees Celsius, but we're more likely going into a 4 to 6 degrees Celsius increase. So in terms of success story, I hope that we can handle soil better than climate, because otherwise I'm really going to become very pessimistic in my outlook. Now, how does that relate to your question? There is a lot of bottom-up happening on climate change. China is replacing polluting energy sources by renewables, non-polluting. But on a voluntary basis, China is the largest investor in wind energy, but at the same time continues to be the largest investor in brown, dirty coal. Not only emitting CO2, but mercury and a couple of other things very nasty on top. And as long as we cannot talk about the fact that there is an urgency and simply waiting for the next 100 years to have this bottom-up activity come to a measurable outcome that effectively addresses the very real global challenge that we're facing, I think we unfortunately don't have the time. That's why I said earlier, too little, too late, if we simply go that route. But that route is important, and I'm the last one to want to discourage it. It should happen. It should be supported by all the means that we have, but it's not going to be enough. Now on the situation in Europe, I don't think that the draft framework directive on soil is as prescriptive as many always make it look. I didn't bring it with me here, but I would happily take some time to talk you through. When we say that we need a requirement in all 27 member states to have a catalog, to have identified contaminated sites, I can't do that simply on a bottom-up. I can't go out there and say, hey, if you understand what this is about and you want to list your little ground as being particularly contaminated, I'm going to wait another 500 years before that's going to happen, because that person is going to lose income by going in and saying, my little territory here is contaminated, don't buy it. Because if you buy it, you'll have to make a lot of investment to clear the ground. There are certain things that you have to set from top down. How much we need to do top down and how much we can leave to regional, local realities is getting more and more challenging in the world in which we live. And is for me one of the most interesting elements of my job, trying to get that balance right. And I agree we need balance. I think we are not erring on the side of those that criticize us for saying you have to plow in that direction and the depth of your plow cannot be more than X, Y, or Z. No one is interested in doing this, not at the European level. If individual countries, if regions come in and think that in their hilly areas, more precise rules on good agricultural practice are useful, let them do it. We from Brussels should and would and want only to set the overall rules that everyone has to apply, and then to leave subsidiarity for everyone to see how these are translated. But subsidiarity can only come in the framework of a defined common policy. If you don't want the common policy, you don't have subsidiarity, you have national policy. And that's a big difference.
We're going to have to wrap it up because I have a couple of minutes left, and there's a gentleman who has a whole group waving while we were talking, so go ahead. I didn't see you, sir. So keep it very brief. We've got 2 minutes in total with the question.
My name is Christian Nolte from FAO. I'm the Senior Officer for Soil Health Management in that organization. Honorable Ministers of the Dynamic Knowledge Panel, I would like to throw some spices into the discussion soup. This evening, my wife will phone me and she will ask me, how was the panel discussion? Well, there are 4 characteristics that will come into my mind. Gray hair, German-dominated, white males, and administrators, if not to say bureaucrats. Why does that matter? Well, where are the young dynamic people? Germans dominated. I hear a lot about regulations and rules. I don't believe that rules and regulations can solve the problem. You can only assist the biggest users of soils, which is the farmers. And where is a representative of the farmer organization here? I don't see any. There was one intervention from one farmer of Wales, and I liked it very much. He said that farming is first and foremost a business. And if we can't give incentives to these people, they will never accept it. And that is not only true in Europe, but it's also true in Africa. If the African farmer produces more than his subsistence level, he looks at it as a business. He wants to have cash in the pocket or food on the table. If you can't deliver these two, you will not succeed with implementing soil-conserving technologies. Professor Töpfer said this morning, he talked about the implementation gap. I think that's a very serious issue because we are debating this issue for, well, I follow the discussion for the last 20 years, but we have a huge implementation gap all over the world. So we have to tackle that. But the biggest implementers, as I said, are the farmers. And we talked a lot about technological approaches, technological solutions. Well, technologies not only have to be technologically constructed, but socially constructed, especially in Africa. For Europeans, that's not so much of an issue. But an African farmer who is not so used to technological change, he has to integrate it into his whole social life. And a farmer, a subsistence farmer, doesn't want to play with his family's life in trying out new technologies. He is risk adverse. So we have to think about risk insurance policies or measures so that when he fails by implementing a new technology, he gets paid for it so that he's not afraid that his family will starve to death. And finally, population growth was mentioned. I work for a UN organization, and I'm not supposed to say this, but I believe that population growth is one of the biggest causes for soil degradation. So we have to tackle that issue somehow. And finally, well, the Germans in the panel always talked about monitoring, regulation, and so on. The voluntary guidelines on land tenure that just came out by FAO, and Alexander Müller will correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I know, they negotiated 8 years or 10 years, and they came out with voluntary guidelines. There was no chance to get restricted guidelines, as far as I know. So how do you want to come to strict rules globally? Thank you.
Okay, we've got exactly 1 minute and a half. So if we want to, Professor Töpfer, can I ask you to address some of the issues?
That's always wonderful. But please don't misunderstand me. I didn't want to excuse myself from my gray hair. And if we come back in 10 years' time, let me see your hair, and then we have a better... So I bring this out of the discussion. I mentioned before that it was for sure not our best idea ever to have here 9 people sitting, all these are men. That was really a mistake. So to mention this again. On the other side, you see, maybe that there was a limitation of language, but what I ask for is not a legally binding global agreement, because I underlined that this seems me to be the alibi for doing nothing. And I listened to His Excellency, his ambassador, that he mentioned already the 5 + 3 years of negotiation for the non-legally binding principles. And I mentioned also the non-legally binding principle on all kinds of forests. So that is not a specific misunderstanding which I cannot correct. I'm very, very convinced that this is a main topic. We tried our utmost to bring more from our agricultural side in the discussion. I can only inform you that the simple fact that we have this discussion with regard to the soil directive in Brussels gives us a little bit of headache, that not everybody would come. I would love it to have more of those here, but again, we are the first time, we can learn, and next time we will invite you to sit here.
And on that note, we want to finish off positively. It's a work in progress, and at least we've had a very, very spirited debate. Clearly, soil is a very rich and complex subject, and I would like to thank you all for participating, the audience. I would like to thank our panelists for being here, answering our questions, and talking to us about soil. And before you all go, I would like to have you all look underneath your chair, if you can. This will be the last thing I'll ask of you. If you just humor me for 1 second. So it's not just the panel that gets to be grilled, it's also each and every one of you, because our question is, what can each and every one of us do to help with soil sustainability? And so what I would like to do is throw the ball in your court and ask you to use the marker that came with it, and write one word, what you would do to help with soil sustainability. And if I could ask you to put it in a box, there's a box outside, and we would like to take your suggestions and use them for later. So if you can humor us this way. Thank you so very much. Thank you to everybody. And yeah.